Now these final steps are designed as steps that where we would compile or make usable our data. Okay? That is our exegetical data, our interpretation data. You can see a couple of the books I have there give you some indication of how they do that. Basically what we're talking about is three areas. One would be outlines, just two different outlines, then an interpretive summary, and then we'll talk later about the adaptation issue here. Okay? Right? But here's the idea here. Let's say I do the book of Philippians. Okay, I've got, a ream of notes. Actually, I know books about that thick. And so I finish that book, and then 5 years later I say to myself, gee, I think I want to start preaching and teaching through Philippians, right? Well, I've got that thick of notes with all these kind of, term analysis and these diagramming things and a lot, these things, pages and pages of stuff, right? And I just can't get myself back to the point at which I was when I finished the thing and having a grasp of the whole. I've just got a bunch of detail stuff, right? But now if I have an outline, actually these three things, start with this analytical outline, basically tells me the contents of the book I worked on. That's the contents of it, okay? And it tells you what kind of things you put into those contexts. Then the exegetical outline is where I have gone through and then through these varying notes and extracted those issues that have interpretive value. Right? And so I've extracted those and then I've embedded them through wording and whatnot into the exegetical outline. So the exegetical outline starts with the analytical. It's just now expanding itself into the interpretation of the text. Okay? If the analytical deals with the contents basically, the exegetical gives me the interpretation of it. Okay? And then the summary, and we'll move through this quick just to get a feel for it. The summary is where you've taken the exegesis of the text, the theme and whatnot, and then you track it in a prose kind of a format, at least that's how I do it, a prose kind of a format that includes all the things that give me the interpretation of the book. May include some background data that I couldn't get in other outlines and whatever, and traces the themes and whatnot through the book. It's not going to be, it's not going to be a massive tome, okay? But it's going to be, a few pages, 5, 6 pages for maybe a Philippians. Could do it in 5 or 6 pages, okay? And then I put those in my file. 5 years later, I come back and say, well, gee, I want to preach through Philippians. Well, that's where I start. You see, I start with my summary, right? Read my summary, get me back to where I was when I finished. You see, and then if I have questions on how did I conclude that, I've got my exegetical outline. Oh, okay. And if I didn't remember how in the world I interpreted that, in other words, I reworded it in some way that didn't come clear, I still got my pile of notes. I can go back and check that out and see where I went. See what I'm saying? So I have that, and it saves me having to redo the wheel again, if you know that little model. I've had experience with that, and maybe you have too, where you have accomplished some great and wonderful thing, right? And then 2 years later, you can't figure out what in the world did I mean by all this, so you got to go back and recreate that great and wonderful thing. Okay, do it all over again. It's crazy. You know how much time we have to spend on doing some of this stuff? I mean, there's a lot of time involved here, a lot of effort involved. Preserve it. That's the name of the game. Preserve it so that 5, 6 years later, you still got it and you can still use it. Right? That's what it's all about. Okay? And let me tell you something. Once you finish the book, even the smallest Philippians, only 4 chapters. Pete's sake. I mean, you could preach for 3 years on Philippians as you work. You're not going to do it. The people wouldn't stand for it just because of their nature, people, But I mean, you could preach. There's so much data there, good stuff, and you could just go on for years and years. It'd almost be like, it wasn't particularly exegetical. It'd almost be like Barnhouse, who preached for 16 years on the book of Romans. I mean, 16 years on the book of Romans, and he died before he finished it. It's amazing for people. I guess it's Fourth Presbyterian in Philadelphia. I guess amazing that they stood there for so long.
I wonder if he did his exegetical study first.
What?
I wonder if he did his exegetical study first.
Well, he now is with the Lord. They're talking it over. So, anyway, this is what we're talking about here. Preserving the stuff here is really key here. Okay? And this has to do, obviously, with the whole book. I mean, that's the way it's laid out here. Okay? I mean, the title of the book, theme of the book, division of the book, etc., etc. Okay? That's what it's related to here. Okay? But also, working through, right at the very beginning of my study, when I'm going to begin a study, let's say when I did the book of Colossians, let's say, did the historical study. Well, I laid it out in the various things that are in our historical study, and then I kind of gave myself a rough analytical outline of the thing. Okay, you know what I'm saying? An analytical outline, kind of roughed it out, and then I kind of utilized that, but adjusted it as I went through the text. Okay, so I have that, right? So it's not like you're doing it right at the end only, you see, right? And then as I'm working through the whole book, then I have that analytical outline pretty much laid out, and as I'm working through then a section, let's say the section that we would call the Thanksgiving section, okay? Well, at that point, when I finish that section, see, then I stop, okay? And then I go back and highlight those key exegetical things that are going to go to an exegetical outline. Okay? Then I do that part, and then I do a summary of that section. Okay? As I move through these various pieces, I might adjust it at some point. Okay? But by the time I'm done, I am done. Okay? I pretty much have it together, except for the summary, the overall summary, when I rewrite the whole thing in a sense, put it all together instead of in pieces. Okay? So that's very helpful. Okay? Let's talk briefly about the adapting the method here. The method itself, as I said, is based upon doing book study. Okay? Well, it can't be done all the time. Sometimes, for various reasons, you have to jump in the middle of a book or something. Okay? I mean, you got a topical interest. Well, I think, let's see, the church here is on prayer, I think, the last month or something. So, they're working on a theme, in other words, a prayer. Well, what one book of the Bible is a prayer book? I mean, that's not what's going to happen. What you're going to do, you're going to choose a text that deals with some aspect of prayer you want to communicate, right? So you're in the middle of something here. So you need to adapt the method to be able to do that. Okay? Or you got the little old lady who comes up. It doesn't have to be a little old lady; it could be a little old man too, I guess. Who comes up and says, "I've been bothered by this text of Scripture." Well, you've got to. You can't say, "Well, I'm going to get to that book about 3 years down the line, so come back then. I'll be dead by then. No, I need it now." You got to adapt the method. You got to get with it, right? And you've got to interpret that the best you can. Come back with an answer somewhere along the line. So there's a reason for adapting it at that point. Okay? I hope that the adaptation doesn't become the norm. I would hope that as you are adapting things, you're also working on something straight through, so that by the time if you're done working it through, you could preach from 2 years on it if you wanted to, and then work on something else. But this happens a lot, adaptation of the method. Gordon Fee, this book is a good little book on exegesis. And again, it's another one of those books that I have the methodology isn't all that comprehensive in some ways. But since it's not, what it has done, of course, notice what he said for students and pastors. Well, neither of them have enough time, so it's just collapsed the thing into a time manageable book. It's only that big anyway. And so essentially, it's an adapted method. Actually, there's 2 parts to the book. One, here's a full exegesis thing. Here, this part of the book. Then the last part of the book is now here's the abbreviated one. Well, I don't suspect that the first part gets used much. It's pretty much the abbreviated one that gets used. And then that probably gets abbreviated. It's already abbreviated. So, at any rate, there's a reason you need to adapt the method here. So, there's some procedures that point out to you. Actually, this is pretty good. Here's what I'm contemplating for the next course. The next course is called Practice of Exegesis. You're doing it, integrating it, coming up with the results. I'm thinking of utilizing major problem passages in the New Testament. Okay? And having you then adapt the method, deal with the problem passages, coming up with good, solid, incontrovertible solutions. Then I can compile those, I can publish those, put my name on it and say, hey, I got the solution to all the problems in the Bible right here.
No, the general acknowledgement.
Yeah, right. You'd be surprised how many books come out that way, though. Done by students. Okay. No, but at any rate, that. No matter how we do it in practice, there's no way you're going to do a whole book. The whole method here. 3rd John would probably work time-wise for you. So we'll have and I'm thinking of that because it would be valuable for you to really interact with those real sticky wickets that are there. Okay, gives you a good challenge. Okay, so anyway, first thing you need to do when you want to adapt the message, you define what text you're going to use. That sounds pretty clear, okay? But then the problem that comes up in the next section, that is, it's too easy to limit the text to the point where you don't know it right offhand, but you've got too limited of a text you're working with to come to a legitimate conclusion. Right? The context is too small. And you say, well, I got to have a small context without having any time, to do any big context, right? Well, you have to talk to God about that when you see Him, okay? But the problem is you want to make sure you got a proper context for that. And then you use your various steps to exegete the passage. And I'll show you that, in fact, we can even utilize this method for what we talked about before, for which we say increasing our skills in the context of a overworked pastoral mission here. Okay. And so as time goes on, you get faster and faster and more skilled, and be able to do more and more with less time, as a matter of fact. Okay. So. Here's one way to do. Let's say you're going to take a passage, or let's take let's take a real sticky wicket. Let's take 1 Peter 3. Christ going to preach to the people in prison, whatever that is. I've got to get that whole thing out there. In the days of Noah, he went and preached. Whatever. That's a real sticky wicket there. That thing, right? Well, okay, so there's some real hard sections to that. So you want to make sure You want to make sure that you got the right amount within which proper interpretation could exist. Okay, so how could you do that? This is one reason for commentaries. Go get commentary. Go get a good commentary that gives you a good outline that you can trust a little bit. Okay, and kind of look through the outline, work through it a little bit. Look at your passage, see how he connects it with the body of the whole thing, right? And once you're comfortable that you see where the connections are, then you're pretty well then able to define what part of the text you really need to do hard work on to be able to come up with a good conclusion for that passage. Okay? So that's one reason to have some commentaries on your shelf so you can do that. Okay? That's helped very significant. Okay? Now, it could be, for instance, in that passage I just mentioned, don't know why I mentioned it, only because one of you guys want to choose that for next time, all right? Bring it on. Yeah, I don't know about that. There's obviously a lot of significant problems. Let's just assume for a second that as you work through the passage, that is from the standpoint of looking over the context, reading the book, it won't take long to read the book, and looking at a commentary gives you a good outline, get a feel for, the section that deals with yours, that is the one you're dealing with, you got a good feel of that, then you say, well, what I would like to go, or I need to go, depending on the situation, is deal with whatever issue is involved. Let's say you want to deal with the issue that talks about how baptism saves people. That may be a more practical oriented one that may come up for somebody here, okay? So to say you want to deal with that. So that's going to be a significant part of your message, right? Okay. You can isolate then, given your time, given the time that you've got, you can pretty much look through that and isolate how much of that you are going to give yourself over to the whole exegetical methodology. Okay? See what I'm saying? So I'm going to say, I'm going to use this verse 21. I'm going to use this phrase, which also now water, which also now, typically in typical fashion, saves you, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus my exegetical methodology stuff on verse 21. Let's say the first part, maybe the whole verse. Verse 21. Okay? The other parts of the passage are going to come into play in my message, let's say. Okay? But I'm going to get help for that at that point. I'm going to utilize, look at my commentary, look at my outline. I'm going to develop my own message, of course, but I'm going to, not going to have time to deal with every problem that occurs here. But that's not the central aspect of what I want to communicate. I want to communicate what's involved in verse 21. So that's where I'm going to put my exegetical time in to that. You see. And so as you work through that, in fact, as you work through that particular passage, boy, there's an awful lot of steps that would come into play. That in itself could take you a significant amount of time just working through that and figuring all that out and looking at various theological commentaries and things like that to see how people have taken that. Okay. So that's one way then of adapting not only the method to, let's say, some inner aspect or some smaller aspect of a larger work, but it's not only adapting that, it's adapting the process to your time, to your situation. Okay? Maybe at some point in time, as you look through this passage, you say, good night, the problems I'm facing, I can't believe this. But I know one thing, I'm going to do a full-blown, I know I need to do this. I need to figure out what this baptism word means here. I know I need to figure that out. I don't have a whole lot of time, but I can find the time to do a full-blown word study on that. And then develop that skill in the process of coming up with part of my sermon. I can do that, you see. Right? And what you will learn in doing that, those kinds of things, will be skills that just isn't going to leave as soon as that sermon is over. Okay, because what you will learn by using the books and using the resources will then accelerate your ability to do a similar kind of thing later on faster. Okay, you see what I'm saying? Okay, or let me give you an example. Early on, back when Noah and the Ark were together, I was working on my exegetical methodology and preaching at that point.
Were you old then too?
Yeah, I was old then too. Yeah. But it would take, let's just say, and I can't give you this, I didn't take notes on this, but I say, I took about, to get ready for preaching a sermon, exegetical work would take me, it's just 20 hours just working through the exegetical side. Then you got to do the communication side. Okay, so it takes 20 hours or something like that early on. Let me tell you something. What used to take me 20 hours, you see, today might take me an hour or a half hour, depending on the situation. Okay, because what I was doing then was learning process, learning how to use the tools, learning how to read it better, right? Learning how all those things we've been talking about, how to integrate this stuff, right? I was in the process of learning the how-tos. Later on, I don't have to learn it anymore. You see, because I know how to do that. You see, you say, well, I need to do a word study. I don't have to think about how to do a word study. You see what I'm saying? I just know what to do and just go do it. You see what I'm saying? Yes.
How long did it take you to get from 20 hours to a half hour? I'm just thinking of how much time I have left. I don't know if I'm going to get there.
I don't know if I got the answer to that on that score. But I know this, that some passages that may take me 20 hours, I could maybe do today in an hour, half hour. Okay. Other passages still are problematic, but it still won't take me the amount of time today that it would before, because now I'm more skilled at to know what to look for and know what to, there's an exegetical sense that occurs. This is kind of the artistic side of this whole thing, you see. There's a sense in which I know what to search out, right, and I know what direction to move right off. Whereas before, I don't know exactly what I need to do here in all of this. You follow my thinking here? For instance, you just take this passage here, which is 6. This is kind of a sticky wicket here. For everybody, including the intelligent part of the people of the world here. Christ once died for sins once for all, righteous and unrighteous, might lead us to God, having been, of course, here's the problem starts, having put the devil on one hand in the flesh, having made lie in the spirit, by the spirit, that's a problem in and of itself, the syntax aspect. Okay, so, and is that Holy Spirit or is that human spirit? What is that? So I know where to go on that already. Now, previously, it may not have that clear. It may not be that clear as to what the issue is. Okay, wherein or in which? Okay, that refers back to the Spirit. I don't have to think about that. Used before, I have to think. Well, see, what does that relative pronoun refer back to? Don't have to think about that. It's obvious, you see. Okay. So in that situation, then, to the spirits, having gone to the spirits in prison. Okay, now there's really a tough stuff. Right now we know about the meanings of the words prison. Now, that's not a difficult thing there. The lexicon is pretty clear. And so is the word for spirits. But what spirits? Now we're talking a different thing now. Not only that, we're talking about now ideas that grew out from some other literary source somewhere along the line. There's some other sources out there that speaks in this thing. Okay? See what I'm saying? And so now I'm thinking, all my information isn't just stuck right here. Okay? Now I know that, I'm pretty much aware that I need to see what the context for that concept was in the ancient day. you see. Before, I may have spent an awful lot of time, and only with difficulty came to that conclusion that I need to do that, you see. See what I'm saying? Same thing. Well, you come down to verses, well, let's see, verse 21, our problem passage, which also now baptism saves you in an atypical way. Well, right now I can see baptism with that ending that we're talking about, and knowing previous knowledge that there is more than one word for baptism, more than one ending for it, and knowing very clearly that there's different intents there. So just as a matter of reviewing and seeing how it applies, and then just on the next phrase itself, where having not the putting off of the filth of the flesh, but of a acknowledgement of an answer of a good conscience toward God. Well, the word answer isn't the same thing. It's got the same issue involved. You see, it's not an answering. It's a result of something. You see, and so that helps me right away. Where I don't have to search the lexicons, the grammars, or whatnot, like I would before. I don't have to spend the time to do that. I know where the issues are. I know what the facts are. Now it's time to just put the whole thing together. You see what I'm saying? So in other words, some passages like that still will take some time, okay? But not as much time as before. Okay? You got time.
You were only like 2 or 3 at the time of that. Right?
I remember it well.
Okay, now, one of the things I'm going to have you do for your assignment, this is going to be fun.
For you?
Huh?
For you?
No, for you, for next time. Work.
Oh, good.
Of course, one of the things you're going to do is do a lot of reading. This will be our last reading opportunity here. And also, it's a quiz preparation opportunity. And your translation, you're going to do Philippians 4. Important to do that. We're going to use that in part for really integrating everything. And then I'm going to have you do this, create an analytical and an exegetical outlines, 2 of them. Okay, from Philippians 1 to 11. We've read that a dozen times. Okay, so now here's what you need to do. Is you need to sit down and you need to take that passage, that's all I'm asking you to do, and you need to give me an analytical outline that gives the content, right? Then you need to go into the details of the text, however you interpret that, and make sure you give some details there. And then transfer the details into an exegetical outline in such a way that the interpretation of that comes through. Okay? Just as an example of what that might look like, and you choose, of course, whatever details you want, okay, would be, let's just take that one problem that we were talking about, but let's say with joy, making this particular request. Okay? Well, let's say your interpretation was that with joy goes back with I give thanks. Right? Your outline needs to reflect that connection. Okay? Or let's say you see that definite article with deis in there, the request, okay, has a particular pointed aspect to it, speaking about something very specific that's not the same as the request, just every request that you mentioned earlier. Well, your outline needs to reflect that. Okay? And for instance, my outline would reflect that. It would also reflect that my interpretation is that verse 9 and following is really the content of that prayer that he's making. Okay? See what I'm saying? So my exegetical outline would give those interpretations, you see. When it comes to, for instance, the idea of fellowship in verse 5, whatever you determine that to mean, somehow that should then reflect itself in the exegetical outline. Okay? See, I mean, if you interpreted that to mean, let's say, just to throw this out as an example, if you interpreted that to mean for your financial contribution to me, okay, then somehow your outline ought to reflect that interpretation. Okay. See what I'm saying? The analytical wouldn't. Let's say the analytical would just talk about fellowship. The exegetical would talk about a specific aspect of fellowship that you may have interpreted that meaning. Right? See what I'm saying? So what you want to do, and this is just giving you a feel for trying to put some things together. That's all I'm trying to do here. All of our outlines are going to be different. All of our conclusions, a lot of conclusions are going to be different. That's not the point here. Okay? Be the same. That's not the issue. The issue is, do you understand the difference between an analytical outline, content-oriented, exegetical outline, interpretation-oriented? And then can you figure out how to embed an interpretation into an outline that's going to be understood a year or two later, should you come back to know what you're talking about? Does it transfer interpretation over? Right? If you had a interpretation of a particular genitive somewhere along the line, well, let's say, for instance, God is my witness, but if you interpreted the mood there as God who is witnessing about me, let's say, an objective genitive as opposed to a possessive genitive in some way, how does your outline reflect that interpretation? You see? See what I'm saying? So that's what I want you to try to experience. And the way I'm going to look at that is I'm going to look at your analytical outline. Is it clear that it relates to the contents are there? Okay. And then I'm going to look at your exegetical outline, and I'm going to see. I'm going to kind of read back, if you will. Okay. There's this wording. What kind of exegetical detail does this entail here? See, if I said, gee, it's just the same thing as an analytic, just content-oriented, it doesn't really specify anything particularly, then I'll say, that's not good. Okay? If a specific interpretation comes through, that's what I'll be looking for. Okay? See what I'm saying? If you interpret a there as a purpose clause, I wanted to see it somehow worded that it shows it a purpose clause, or a result clause, or whatever kind of clause you interpret it to be. You see? Right? So that's what I want to be able to see. Make myself clear, just like a pile of mud. Yeah.
A couple questions. This is all done in English, I suspect.
English. Done in English.
Is there any place we can get an example of what one of these looks like?
What
both outlines would look like, so we can just say, oh, that's what you want.
Well, I would like to say yes. I have some good examples in my files. I have one more. The books. What books show this? The problem with most books, even good commentaries, is almost all the outlines are analytical. Okay. There's not a transfer of exegetical detail into the wording of an outline oftentimes, right? So you really don't know how to interpret a passage, okay? See what I'm saying? You just know that there's a content issue there. So you have to then, even in those books, you have to go to their discussion to see what in the world they're talking about, what they interpret that to mean, you see, right? What I'm saying that an exegetical outline should eliminate the necessity to constantly run back to your notes to find out what you were talking about. See? So what I would say is, I've got Grassman down here and Trina, you may be familiar with both of those, who do some work on outlines, But I'd have to say, from the standpoint of the exegetical part, okay, that they still don't nail down the exegetical dimension to that. Okay, so it's I think that's the most valuable part of it all for preserving your data. See, my Philippians notebook has got to be at least that thick, and it's pages and pages of term analysis, observations of all kinds, from the textual critical to history, to emphases in the text, word order, all kinds of things. And now, obviously, every bit of those pieces aren't exegetically significant from the standpoint of giving me the interpretation of that section. You see, right? But we got underlined or highlighted that the things that are exegetically significant that interpret the text. Those are the things that get transferred over. Okay. But if I had to go back and read reams of these things, I'd get lost just in reading, and I wouldn't be able to connect where I was at in interpretation.
So, how many pages would you have for Philippians 1 through 11?
How many pages? I'm trying to think how many pages I got for that. Well, at least it includes a diagram, all the term analysis and the discussions. It's got to be at least 8-10 pages or more type,
So I'm kind of, I would agree with John. It would be helpful for us to see something. So if you were taking all those main exegetical points and putting them into your outline, are you thinking you'd have something maybe half that size?
Now I'm seeing. I'm talking about my exegetical notes.
Yeah.
Now, once I highlight the things that are critical, okay. Now, actually, my analytical outline of Philippians, no more than at the most 2 pages. Not even that, probably the whole thing.
Okay. For the whole book.
For the whole book.
Okay.
The exegetical outline is a little different story now. That may expand from 2 pages now into maybe 6 pages. Okay? Because I'm going back and taking one segment that may just have the Thanksgiving formula. That's in my analytical outline, 3 to 11, right? Well, but when I look at my exegetical notes, the things that are significant, interpretively significant, that I may want to transfer 10 things into my outline. You see, that kind of guide the interpretation through there. So I want to deal with the issue that we just talked about, maybe the prayer issue, certainly, right? I want to deal with how I interpreted the issue of the fellowship word, or what's involved in this, he who began in you a good work. What good work is that? You see what I'm saying? And so those are the kind of things I want to transfer. Okay? And so they will be then become part of that outline. Okay? And then they're not lost, if you will, in that pile of paper. See? Any other questions? I don't have an example to give you. I was looking at one to pull out and show you, but then I said, the problem with this is that I can show you how this looks in, I wouldn't do this passage for you, but I could show you how it looks, let's say, in another book, like, 2 John or something I got there. I could pull that, or Colossians or Ephesians or something. But I don't know that it would help you. I have to go back and explain, well, now, here's a genitive absolute that is important here. That's the issue. The genitive absolute, but it leads to a particular interpretation, right? And so this is the wording I've given to it to get that interpretation across for that genitive absolute in that section. You see what I'm saying? But there's so many things that are unique, to every exegetical detail that you want to preserve, if you will, that I don't know how much helpful that would be. Maybe it would have been, but It's too late now. Forget it. Nice try, John, but forget it. No, I'm just kidding.
What's it going to look like when you look at a page?
Well, what I was thinking is like, if you have a verse and you've got your interpretation, and then on your outline underneath that, you'd say this was interpreted this way because of genitive absolute. I'm thinking of more structure of the format.
Yeah, no, I don't do it particularly that way. I don't say it's a bad way to do it. That would certainly add a lot of work to the process. But also, there's this practical dimension. See, part of the exegetical outline for me is to work through the word terminology, the English terminology, to communicate a Greek conclusion based on the Greek text. Okay, to work through that terminology, because then I'm going to use that, and I need to communicate and preach that. I don't want to talk about a genitive absolute in the sermon, or even in teaching a Sunday school class of non-Greek people. Okay, I don't want to talk about genitive absolutes. I want to talk about, in good English, the force of that in the meaning of the text. You see, and so to say, well, I'll just give this wording, don't give a whole lot of thought to the wording, I'll just put based on a genitive absolute, kind of cuts that process short, it seems to me. At least for me it would. Okay. And I think part of the problem when people say things like, and I think they got it wrong philosophically anyway, but when they say, well, don't take your tools into the pulpit, what they really mean is, you don't use Greek words and Hebrew words and stuff like that in the pulpit. Well, I think that's backwards anyway, because the tool is not Greek and Hebrew, the tool is English. Most of the time, what I see simply there is they haven't done enough work figuring out how in English do I communicate this principle. How do I communicate the force of a perfect tense in English without using technical terminology in a way that the people will catch the principle? That's the work that needs to be done for the communication side, you see. And so I think working through from analytical to exegetical can be part of the process of figuring out how to communicate that. At least for me, that's true. And for this assignment, that's true for you too. So make sure when you look at the text then that you've got some specific interpretive issues that are involved there. In other words, you want to say, well, in fact, I would like to see, though I'm not going to make it a requirement, I would like to see what you do, let's say, with a adverbial participle of cause. I'd like to see how you transfer the concept, perfect tense, okay? Or I'd like to see how you transfer an appositional statement, an appositional word, which may have importance. Or I'd like to see how you deal with the present tense of the infinitive or the subjunctive or something that can be very interpretive, that is very significant, without using the technical terminology, right? See, I'd like to see how you take a word study that you've done and then you've brought a conclusion to and transferred that conclusion in a way that I can connect what you said to actually what is in the text without jargon of some sort. Okay? Right? I'd like to see that. If you had, for instance, if you concluded that epitelese in verse 6, let's say, was just a wild example here, it was a progressive future. How do you transfer it into an outline without saying progressive future? And how do you transfer it in a sermon without saying to the people, progressive future? They're going to progress in the future right out of there. That's what's going to happen. Okay? You follow me? So make sure you can nail down some things. And work on the transfer process. I'm not saying it has to be so many, and I'm not saying it has to be so long. If you only have one thing there, I would wonder how much thinking you really gone through this project. Okay, but if you got 87 things, I would say, geez, how long is it going to take to read this thing?
So 4.
Okay. Questions? Okay, here's your assignment. I've already given you that key part. There's going to be another quiz, of course. That's the last one. And on the quiz, it'll be asked, have you read and translate all of the lessons? Right. Okay. That's good. You know what that was already there. Okay. So, and then there'll be questions that relate to the readings as well. Okay. So, and I hope you've understood that when I've chosen questions for the readings, I haven't looked for the most insignificant detail I can find. Most of the time I'm looking for, to use as a quiz, just some of the things that should stand out, some of the significant things. You may not think they were significant. I mean, that's a judgment call there. But that's what I'm looking for, those kinds of things that would be good to connect with this reading, you see. So just keep that in mind.
Is that our last one?
Huh?
Is next class our last class?
Yep, that's it. Okay.
Is there extra credit if we know the author of Hebrews?
Put down the quiz.
It's extra credit if you can prove it and validate it without question.
That would be